So what I've been warning about for years is finally happening right in front of our eyes. We're watching the end of globalization unfold in real time. And what's happening right now at the highest levels of global power is going to reshape your life whether you're paying attention or not. Globalization has failed the West and the United States of America. The world has changed dramatically, and what we're seeing is the framework for a completely new world order being negotiated as we speak. Here's the simplest way to understand how the world has worked for the last 80 years. After World War II, the major powers came to an agreement about how to structure everything. China became the factory of the world. Japan became the lender, keeping interest rates at zero to keep the system liquid. Europe became the buyer and consumer, trading away their productivity and military strength for stability and social welfare. And the United States became the enforcer, with the petrodollar as the world's reserve currency, backed by the most powerful military in history. This system has been called the proof of weapons network. If countries wanted to trade or needed money to build their economies, they had to follow specific rules. Use dollars to buy energy, and don't mess with U.S. interests. The petrodollar guaranteed the world needed American dollars for energy. The military enforced the rules. Financial institutions and central banks managed the money flow. If you played by the rules, you got access to investment markets and protection. If you broke them, you got sanctions or war. If you're an American, depending on which side of the wealth divide you were on, you indirectly benefited. U.S. companies made enormous money. Investors made money and retired comfortably. But the downside nobody talks about is that keeping this system running requires forever war, constant military presence. And if you're working-class American, it's been devastating because this system exported all the jobs. Supply chains left, factories closed. This concentrated wealth at the top while hollowing out the middle class, creating fragile dependency on other nations. America stopped making stuff. We only made money and technology. Technically, it still works that way, at least on paper. But we're reaching the end because nations have teamed up and said we'll make our own system. They've become so powerful that the proof of weapons network can't enforce the old rules without triggering World War III. At the recent World Economic Forum in Switzerland, the people controlling global power openly said, "This game is over." So now Japan is bringing capital home, selling U.S. treasuries like other nations. This weakens the dollar because it needs perpetual demand that's disappearing. Europe learned that depending on others for energy and outsourcing security means no power when things go wrong. What we're left with is the question discussed at the World Economic Forum. How do we divide power in this new world order? I want to show you who the players are, what they want, and what this looks like. The old game played since World War II for 80 years is ending. It lines up with the fourth turning, a generational model showing every 20 years brings a new cycle. The high, the awakening, the unraveling, and now the crisis, the reset. That's where the World Economic Forum in Davos comes in, where the world's most powerful people gather to discuss the new game. Let me explain who the players are and what they want. This gets complex with different power structures and competing incentives, all trying to grab a piece of whatever replaces the old system. There are four groups of power. First are the financial globalists, or transnational capital. They don't pledge allegiance to any flag or represent national interests. They are money, and money flows anywhere. That's why it's transnational. At the top are the asset managers. The apex predators are BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, managing tens of trillions. They thrive when capital moves anywhere, anytime. That money isn't theirs, it's their clients', but it gives them a superpower. Every corporation becomes subordinate to them. Corporations optimize for capital access. Through managing capital, asset managers vote on behalf of shareholders. If you buy mutual funds or ETFs at BlackRock, your money goes to different funds, but you don't vote on what companies within those funds do. Most people don't bother. BlackRock's data shows in 2025, of $7.4 trillion in total index equity, only $3.65 trillion was eligible for voting. Only $812 billion actually voted. That's 11%. 89% of client votes were exercised by BlackRock executives, not the actual owners. So even though asset managers don't technically own the money they manage, they're using their clients' money to vote on which direction companies go and who sits on corporate boards. Downstream from that is everything else. Access to capital, access to markets, all of it. That's why Larry Fink is at the absolute top of this food chain. And what you have to understand about this power structure is that it doesn't need to pass laws or control the military directly, because by controlling capital flows, they guide most of the major decisions. If you're the CEO of a company and money flows toward you, your company grows. But if it leaves and you get kicked out of the index, your company shrinks and you get fired. So if you want to succeed, you're probably going to do what you're told. That's the ultimate superpower. Now, I should also mention there's not just one apex predator here. There's another one, and that's the banks and the Federal Reserve. Asset managers and banks are separate players with their own unique interests. You can tell from this fascinating exchange between Larry Fink and Christine Lagarde, where she drops a hint that central banks might not always exist in the future. I'm not going to tell you that central banks will always be around either. And Larry Fink immediately picks up on that and asks her to clarify what she means. She refuses to elaborate, but mentions that central bankers being the only game in town is not the right approach to a balanced equilibrium. So asset managers are separate from banks, and they're actually competing with each other. On the bank side, the apex predator is Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase, and he openly says he's a globalist. When asked directly, he said, "Here's your headline, I'm a globalist." A globalist means if it were up to him, he would continue the world order exactly as it exists today. He wants NATO to be strong. He wants to protect the interests of the West. He wouldn't change much at all. He wants a stronger NATO, a stronger Europe. He's not a tariff guy, though he would use them strategically. The central banks are resisting all of these changes, which makes sense because they're the power structure that benefited the most from the old system. So asset managers and banks, two different players wanting two different things, but both are part of the same overarching power structure, what's been called the financial industrial complex. The second group of power players are what you might call the sovereigns. These are the leaders of Tier 1 nations, meaning those with access to nuclear weapons. A sovereign is someone who believes globalization is a threat to their power and control. A sovereign isn't necessarily trying to win the globalization game. They're just trying not to lose control of their own country. Their power comes from things like laws, borders, tariffs, and sometimes they're willing to sacrifice economic growth for sovereignty and independence. They're willing to accept economic pain to maintain control over industry, energy, and security. Who are they specifically? Someone like Vladimir Putin, a guy who doesn't want to privatize his nation's resources. He doesn't care if Russia's stock market underperforms. He wants Russian oil to be drilled only by the Russian government, not by ExxonMobil or Chevron. He doesn't care if Russian stocks underperform compared to U.S. markets. Sovereigns don't care if the rest of the world doesn't want to play with them. The same can be said of China's Xi Jinping. He prefers state control and long-term strategic growth over access to Western capital. Same with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. Different context, but the same principle. Sovereign power resists globalization because they know they cannot win that game. And that's why the financial-industrial complex hates them so much. They're unpredictable and inefficient from a capital allocation perspective. But they're popular with their own people. Their voters keep choosing them because they promise control, order, and obedience. They have clean streets. They have stability. Their people often support them. In a nutshell, they understand that allowing transnational capital into their countries would mean giving up all the leverage they currently have. The third group are the technologists, sometimes called the technocrats. They don't really care about nationalism versus globalism. They care about efficiency, scale, and networks. They believe technology will eventually replace or automate much of what governments and institutions are doing right now. But it's important to understand that technologists are not at the top of the power structure. They don't control the capital flows. They can work with almost any player in the system as long as they get funding, access to data, and permission. In that sense, they're also transnational because their software goes beyond borders. And as globalization breaks down, they actually get more powerful. How? Financial power pushes for programmable money, digital IDs, social credit scores, automation, robots, all of it. Capital moves in their direction and they gain leverage. They have significant influence, but they're not quite as powerful as the financial players in this structure. Then there's the fourth group, the military-industrial complex. This is the enforcement layer. Their power comes from force and intelligence agencies. They thrive on instability, and their role is to enforce whatever system is currently in place. They're not really subordinate to the government like you might think. They're more subordinate to the financial-industrial complex, because it's financial power that dominates government, not the other way around. Now that you hopefully understand who the players are, the next question is, what do they actually want? Let me start with the most powerful group, the financial-industrial complex. One of those players, the asset managers, they want a world where capital stays liquid, fast, and controllable, even if nations fragment. Deglobalization is a massive problem for them because borders slow money down. Different countries mean different rules, different currencies, different settlement systems. All of that creates friction. It adds cost and complexity, everything they don't want to deal with. Their solution is tokenization and fractionalization, which Larry Fink has talked about for years. I think the movement towards tokenization and decimalization is necessary. I think we need to move very rapidly toward doing that. We would be reducing fees. We would be doing more democratization. Tokenization means taking assets like stocks, bonds, real estate, commodities, whatever, and putting them on a blockchain so they can trade instantly, globally, 24/7. Fractionalization means breaking those assets into smaller pieces so more people can own them and they can move faster. Now you can live anywhere in the world, and regardless of which country you're from, anyone can buy stocks from anywhere. But what that also does in practice is hugely benefit whoever controls the infrastructure. Asset managers already control the assets, but tokenization allows them to control the rails as well. In the future, artificial intelligence is going to play a huge role in managing this system. And because it's on blockchain rails, they'll have all the tools to see everything happening in real time. They'll be able to take advantage of that information for better or worse. But remember, there are also the bankers. What do the banks want? Preferably to keep everything the same. But their biggest goal right now is to avoid the privatization of money. Here's a central banker at Davos saying exactly this. The first threat is privatization of money. In other words, they don't want to be disintermediated. They don't want to be cut out of capital flows. They don't want to be made irrelevant. How do they stay relevant? Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. This is how the old system is trying to maintain power. If cash is disappearing, if private payment rails are taking over, if tokenized assets are routing around traditional banks, and if asset managers are building new infrastructure without the banks, that shrinks bank power dramatically. CBDCs are a way for central banks to have their own programmable money. Banks have to be very careful here, because if corporate CBDCs are allowed to exist, and if they pay interest or yield, that threatens bank deposits. Banks don't want their deposit money leaving because customers are buying corporate-issued digital currencies, like a hypothetical Tesla coin that pays 5% annual interest instead of a savings account that pays 0.2%. That's an existential threat to banking power. So remember, banks want CBDCs and control over what corporations can and cannot do with them. But they have competition, and their biggest competitor is the crypto lobby. The crypto lobby is challenging the banks, and what crypto people want is fair competition. In a fair game, crypto wins. Crypto knows that. Banks know that. Here's the CEO of the biggest crypto company in the US saying exactly that. I think Americans should be able to earn more money on their money. Banks should have to compete on a level playing field. If the American people feel like banks aren't paying high enough interest rates and stablecoin rewards can offer them more, then maybe banks should have to pay higher interest rates to compete. That was Brian Armstrong. He wants rules that allow the crypto lobby to compete fairly with the banking lobby. Crypto people want control over CBDCs so they can pay you higher interest rates for holding your cash with them, which threatens bank deposits, the bank's core source of power. But guess who has more money, more lawyers, and more political influence? The banks, which is why the crypto lobby is frustrated right now, because the legislation isn't fair to them. It's not designed to be fair. That's how the game is played. At the very top, we have asset managers, then banks, then crypto powers. Depending on how regulation goes in the future, meaning who has the bigger wallet for politicians, this hierarchy might flip, and the crypto lobby could eventually overtake the banks. That's the financial industrial complex structure. Power player number one. Power player number two are the sovereigns. What do sovereigns want? Almost the opposite. They care about having a seat at the table and control of their own resources. Their ideal world is one where they control their energy, food, industry, and security, even if that means slower growth and weaker markets. Some countries just want to be left alone. Other countries want to consolidate power regionally and absorb nearby territories. Russia with Ukraine, China with Taiwan, the US with Venezuela and Greenland and other places. Some of these countries have expansionary ambitions. They want a seat at the table, which is why Russia says they'll join Trump's Board of Peace and pay $1 billion if they can use frozen Russian funds and help broker Middle East deals. They want to be part of the new system. Then you have the technologists. They don't care who's in charge politically. What they want are government contracts, data access, and maybe bailouts if that keeps them spending. In return, they'll develop digital IDs, robots, social credit systems, and they'll trade data and technology with whichever faction happens to be in power. And there's the military-industrial complex. They weren't heavily represented at the World Economic Forum, but their interests are usually in stability, which justifies spending, which enriches defense contractors, which ultimately serves as a proxy for the financial industrial complex. Now the good news, if all goes well, the world shouldn't be heading toward World War III. Instead, we should hopefully see less invasion and less occupation because the forever war model is unwinding. In a nutshell, asset managers want programmable money. Crypto people want fair competition. Banks don't want to become irrelevant. Sovereigns want control over their own countries without being destabilized while having a seat at the negotiating table. Technologists want access to funding, and the military is there to enforce whatever rules get established. A lot of what I've said is simplified, but it's based on verifiable information. The most important takeaway is that I'm not describing altruism versus evil or good versus bad. This is just power versus power. Different factions competing for influence in a changing world. There's a lot I don't want to say, not because I'm not allowed to, but because I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist. But if I could give you my personal opinion about all of this, I think much of this has already been negotiated behind closed doors. What we're watching is political theater. What we're seeing in Venezuela, Greenland, Russia, it's theater to justify decisions that have already been made. It's geopolitical posturing. Countries asking themselves in this new game, how do I want to be perceived? Am I weak? Am I strong? What's my identity here? That's the theater. And algorithms are making us engage emotionally with all of it. But the reality is that the range of possible outcomes has likely already been pre-negotiated. Maybe not the exact script, but the general framework has been established. But hey, in the meantime, enjoy watching the celebration or humiliation of certain people. I can't prove it, but that's my theory. I want to give credit because some of this framework was borrowed from Simon Dixon, who's talked about these topics for years and made countless videos about them. If you're interested in this kind of analysis, I'd recommend checking out his YouTube channel because it's a rabbit hole you won't be coming out of. I'd love to hear your thoughts about all of this. What do you think is really happening behind the scenes? Are we watching a genuine power struggle or carefully orchestrated theater? The world is changing faster than most people realize, and understanding who holds the levers of power might be the most important thing you can do right now.